Hey everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am Demetrius Nealon and I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and I'm going to be covering a bunch of DSC and what's going on with Winget, and I'm having fun with my presentation, getting the slides to advance here. There we go. So I don't know how many of you have seen what we announced at Build with Winget configuration. This is sort of an area that's near and dear to my heart. That's part of the reason that I started working on the team developing Winget, the Windows Package Manager. And, you know, we did a lot of research, and the research told us the number one problem most people had was poor internal documentation helping them get set up. There wasn't a whole lot we could do that area. You know, a lot of software evolves, new updates happen. You know, it's a pretty painful situation to live in. And problem number two was things like it takes too long to compile a project or build something or to, you know, automate some kind of a process. There's some things we've done there with performance in terms of, you know, the Visual Studio IDE and compilers and things like that. We've done some enhancements with the REFS, or the resilient file system, supported on Windows 11. But number three that we saw was really the biggest one that we thought we could tackle, which is it's hard to get your environment set up. Typically, your instructions are outdated, kind of what we identified in problem one. And then the other thing was, you know, that it was just typically hard for you to go and find somebody that knew exactly how to get the environment set up and get it into the state that it needs to be in for you to be productive. We built a bunch of samples, and I'll share the link and show you in the browser, but these are some of the projects that we built configurations for, and we're still working on providing additional samples. So one of the big things was, rather than looking at inventing a completely new technology stack, was leveraging something that's been around since about 2013, which is PowerShell's desired state configuration. And that was something we felt pretty strong about. We didn't want to fragment a community. We didn't want to come out and invent a new technology that everybody had to relearn. But there's definitely still some learning curves involved, and I'll be covering some of that in the talk today. One of the main things that people struggle with, and we're looking at some improvements there, I'll get some feedback from you on that, but it's how do I find these PowerShell DSC resources? You can search for them at the PowerShell gallery. You can also search for them at the DSC community website. And this is really where I think the bulk of the work is going to land in terms of building configurations, finding the resources that exist that work correctly, and potentially building them. There's three really simple interfaces on them. They're designed to be an interface or an abstraction. So you're going to be able to get the state of a resource, and there's a get method. You pass in the properties in JSON to see if it's in the desired state. There's a test method that will return true if the machine is in the state. And then there's a set method that will actually go make those changes happen and get the device into your desired state. We decided on YAML since we'd already had YAML manifests for Winget as a package manager. And, you know, many of you are probably more familiar with imperative, which is, you know, you can imagine a sequence of steps. You know, step one, install the package. Step two, go modify some registry keys or change some settings somewhere. Step three, and so on. One of the reasons we went with declarative is that it allows us to make some performance improvements and possibly do things in parallel where we just don't have that option if we're just following a sequence of steps in a logical order. So if you look at the README in the GitHub project for Windows Terminal, you're going to see a whole bunch of instructions. They don't necessarily you know, have to be run in this order, but this is very much sort of a, you know, structured approach, step-by-step guide. When we look at the configuration for this, you'll see a bunch of YAML here. We're doing things like turning on developer mode. We're installing things like PowerShell 7, the Windows SDK, and a few other things. But you can see there's not a particular order in here, so we could do things in parallel in some cases. We can also set up dependencies. So in this example, on the right-hand side, you can see we're enabling developer mode. The ensure keyword at the bottom is really common. You'll see ensure present to make things in that particular state. The opposite of that would be absent. If I go a little further down, you'll see the resource I'm using is the Microsoft Winget DSC module, the Winget package. This is going to install NPM, which is part of Node.js. And you can see there's a dependency in there for the NPM package so that we guarantee we're not trying to install the Grunt CLI ahead of getting Node.js installed. In this second example, we're showing something that's sort of new. This isn't really something that was part of the configuration syntax or previous versions of desired state configuration. We've defined an assertion here, and it's just making sure that the machine is in the desired state before continuing. So in this one, we're checking a minimum version of Windows. If the device doesn't have that minimum version, this assertion is going to return false, and we're not even going to run the rest of the configuration. And in this section, we're pulling in Visual Studio workloads, and we're looking at making sure we have the right version of Visual Studio installed. That's where that depends on keyword shows up on the second line on the right. So that's a bit of a primer. I know I went pretty quickly, but I wanted to get into some of the hands-on stuff here. So I'm going to start out by showing you a configuration that I've got. This is a new DSC resource that we're working on, is the Microsoft Windows Developer Module. Let me zoom in here. And I've got some comments at the top. These are some new things we're adding. So this is just a simple example of showing seconds in the clock, aligning your taskbar. We've got a couple more for enabling dark mode, showing hidden file extensions. I've got a note on there that Explorer must be restarted to do that, and we consider that potentially risky behavior. And this is definitely a not even published module yet for some of these newer settings. The only one that's published today is the making sure that the developer mode is enabled in Windows. But I wanted to show sort of some fresh, hot new bits that we're working on. We will be publishing these to the PowerShell gallery in the coming weeks as we continue to refine on this. But I think a lot of what I wanted to go into here was just kind of an overview and an example of some of these configurations and the reality, the product truth, and where we're going in the future. I'll cover a little bit of that as well. So you can see this configuration is going to show the seconds in the clock. It's going to left align the taskbar. I've commented out the ones that require Explorer to restart just because they make the UI look a little interesting and they don't apply those settings. And at the bottom, you can see I'm installing Git from Windows Package Manager from the community repository from the Winget source. And then after that, I'm actually going to clone the Wingate CLI project. And I'm doing this on the D drive in a directory called GitHub. And this is actually using that REFS volume, the dev drive. So it actually will do things for cloning much faster because it's optimized for smaller file sizes. And it can also help improve your performance with build and compile options. So if I open up my GitHub directory, you'll see I don't have the Winget CLI. I'm going to go ahead and run this configuration. I'm going to do this using the regular Winget command, and then I'll switch over and show you what this looks like in PowerShell. So it's going to go through, it's going to parse the YAML file. It's going to show all of the different resources that are going to be applied. And then you're going to get a lovely warning about, hey, this is really powerful. This can do anything to your system. Are you sure you want to do this? I'm going to go ahead and tell it yes. And as it's running, you'll see I have seconds displayed on my clock. My taskbar alignment has moved to the left. We have gone through the process to ensure that Git is installed, and it's actually now cloning that project. And if I go back into File Explorer, you'll see the Winget CLI has been cloned on my device. And that was all completely automated through PowerShell DSC just by running that one command. Now, I don't want my main desktop in this state, so I've got another configuration that I've created called reset. And it's basically doing the exact opposite. It's saying that the seconds and clock are absent. It's putting my taskbar alignment back to the middle on line 16. In this case, I could have it go ahead and uninstall Git, but I don't want it to do that. So I've commented out the ensure absent. But that shows you an example of how to uninstall a package. And I'm doing the same thing on line 35. I really don't want to remove the Git directory that the Git project that I've cloned, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how to run this using PowerShell. And I found it's pretty useful to build configurations that will set your machine up and to kind of build the opposite that will undo everything. So you'll notice that my seconds are now hidden in my clock again, and I've got my taskbar alignment back to the middle. So one of the things that we've been working on and looking at is environments other than just your desktop. So one of the first ones that we're tackling is the Windows Sandbox. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Windows Sandbox, but you can think of it similar to a container. It's going to essentially spin up a new virtualized Windows environment, and it doesn't have very many things installed. It won't even have Winget installed in there when we kick this thing off. But I've got some other scripts that I've built, and I'll walk through those. The top resource here that's commented out, the Windows optional feature, I was working on this one trying to get the Windows Sandbox enabled following some of the documentation at Microsoft Learn, but I found it didn't quite work. So we've got some work to do there to update the documentation and to make sure we've got everything working correctly. Again, I'm showing you, a lot of product truth and where things live today and talking a little bit about the vision we want to go. So this Windows Sandbox DSC resource is really designed to just spin up the Windows Sandbox. And typically what you're going to do is you're going to have a .wsb file that's just a renamed XML file. And that file defines a lot of things about the Sandbox environment, things like whether or not you want to use your video acceleration, if you want to plumb audio or video through, or if you want to use the clipboard. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm taking a folder on my host device, the C Sandbox MiniCon, and I'm going to basically map that folder into the Sandbox. But in the Sandbox, it's going to be under C project. And then I'm running a logon command, and I'll scroll to the right so you can see what this is doing a little bit better. I'm basically just going to kick off this bootstrap Sandbox script. This is actually going to run in Windows PowerShell because PowerShell 7 is not in the Sandbox. And I'm passing in the installer directory that I want to use as that C project directory that got mapped earlier. We'll do a quick look at the bootstrap script. So you can see I'm taking that installer directory at the top, and I'm using join path. I've already downloaded these installers into that folder on my local device. I'll show you that folder. So I've got the app installer that contains Winget. I've got the vclibs dependency, and I've got the PowerShell 7 MSI installer. just as a convenience to get it bootstrapped. And then I've got these scripts in here so that I can run them from inside the sandbox. The other thing I've done is I've grabbed the PowerShell modules that contain the resource for cloning the Git project, as well as the new version of the Windows developer that has some of those other settings. So when I run the sandbox configuration, we're going to create the sandbox. We're going to copy those files into C project, and it's not really copy, it's really just connecting it with the local folder. So if I make the changes in the sandbox, it's actually changing that on my local file system. And then I'm going to kick off this bootstrap script. So I'm going to show you what that looks like now. It's now spinning up the Windows Sandbox for me. I'll go ahead and maximize this. And you'll see that logon script will kick off. And I've got some output in there that we'll take a look at once this is done. I did learn that even though I had made a path available for PowerShell 7, it actually doesn't work in the Windows Sandbox. Let me zoom in here. Oh, that was an epic fail. Sorry about that. I'll just run it again. That's one of the nice things about using the sandbox. It essentially just gets destroyed and recreated. As soon as you close the sandbox, you lose everything that's in there. It's ephemeral. So it's not going to be like a Docker environment or something that is going to continue persisting over time like a VM. It's just sort of a point in time. So you can see we installed the vclibs dependency for the app installer. We installed the app installer. I went ahead and copied those modules over into the modules directory so that I can use them on this device. I've installed PowerShell 7. And then this is where Steve Lee helped me earlier with the path issue. So you can see the path isn't there. But now if I do pwsh, it actually is available to the system. So I do, wow, it's not cooperating. It did this morning. That's pretty funny. So let's do this. PowerShell 7. So now that I've got PowerShell 7, I'm going to go ahead and run the script for bootstrapping things in here. So you can see the project directory that I've got mapped to what was in the MiniCon on my local. And you can see I've got this set of scripts here that I ran. I'm going to go ahead and run the setup script. It's setting the gallery to be trusted so that it can install the WinGet DSC module that also pulls in the Winget client module so that I can use the PowerShell commandlets for installing packages. And then it's going to pull in the configuration module that allows me to call invoke Winget configuration or start. It goes ahead and kicks off that configuration for me. And what this one is going to do is some of the settings that we saw before on my local device, but now it's applying them in the sandbox. So you can see my seconds and my clock. You can see the taskbar has gotten aligned to the left. It's now going to pull in Git and start running the configurations that were set up there. And this takes a little bit of time because it does have to install and run what's in there. So I'll go ahead and show you that script now. So this was the first one that we ran to trust the PowerShell gallery. The second one to install Winget DSC that also pulls in the Winget client. I had to specify allow pre-release because that module is marked pre-release at the gallery, and the same thing for the Winget configuration. Now, the second one that this setup script is attempting to run is the one for the Winget CLI. So if I go in, you'll see on my C drive, that's been cloned. And then inside this project, we're using the convention for GitHub to put in the configuration for the project. And if I open this up on this local system, you'll see that it's going to turn on developer mode. It's going to install Visual Studio 22. And then after that, it's going to configure Visual Studio using the vsconfig file from that project. This actually takes quite a while. I'm going to go ahead and get this kicked off and running, and then we'll go back to the rest of the presentation. And hopefully, if we're lucky, it'll actually finish in time to show you what it looks like when it's done. I've had mixed results on how long this takes because it's doing quite a few things here. So I'll go ahead and minimize that while it runs. So a lot of the tips that we run into are things about, how do I build a configuration? And this is really what we're looking at. We've seen a lot of gaps related to how you find the resources, what resources are available, and how to build them. So I recommend go through and test this out on a sandbox or a clean VM and build these configuration files incrementally. It's often the case that you've got a working environment and you're attempting to kind of capture everything from memory, or you're copying the instructions that you've got in a wiki. Sometimes you'll give yourself a false positive. So you want to do this one resource at a time and then go through and test them. You can also use Winget configure test or test Winget configuration. And that will also help when you're wanting to build up these configuration files. And if you're really brave, we'd love to see more DSC resources out there. That's really the long gap that we're running into with Winget configuration, is how many are out there. So we've got a lot of samples at DevHome, and that's where the aka.ms/Winget link, /DSC.YAML link goes. And we're looking for feedback. And I'll pull up some issues at GitHub and show you some of what we're doing with the roadmap. So this query is using the label command configure, and this pulls up all of the issues that we have at Winget. So you'll see there's some bugs in there, and there's a handful of issues. We've been working with Steve Lee and the PowerShell team on PowerShell DSC v3, and that's one of the areas that we're looking to get into a little bit deeper. So one of the first things that we know is hard with building these configurations is having resources available. So I've created this issue as a tracking issue, and we have been working with PowerShell team, Windows Terminal, DevHome, and PowerToys. And I recently reached out to Jan de Dablier at Oh My Posh about a DSC resource there. So this is just kind of helping track some of those particular projects. And we want to be able to have a mapping between the Winget packages and the PowerShell resources. So if I go back into the issues here, I didn't get it mapped correctly for the command configure, but we're going to add a DSC pointer in the configuration file that maps to these resources so that we can get into what I think a lot of people are really going to be excited about, which is generating a configuration from your machine state. So the idea is you're going to be able to run something like Winget configure export or export-Winget configuration in PowerShell that is going to iterate over all of the packages installed on your machine. It's going to go check the manifest for the package at the repository that you're configured for. If there's an associated DSC resource, it's going to go ahead and pull that down. And there's a new method called export that works a lot like you would expect for get star. Today, you have to pass in the properties that you want to pull out of a configuration. And in the future, there's going to be an export verb that will just give them all to you. And we'll be able to use that to not only figure out what packages are installed, but we'll also be able to pull how they're configured. We'll include the Microsoft.Windows.Developer module and pull out those Windows settings. So things like, I showed before with seconds and clock and your taskbar alignment, but several other Windows settings like developer mode and possibly some other properties that you would want, and would love to get sort of a list from you of which things you would want as Windows settings exported. And then from there, you'd be able to easily move that to another machine. And you saw in my demo how much work there is to get things working for the sandbox and for things like Hyper-V VM or Azure VMs and other remote environments. So we're definitely looking at how we can make it easier for you to stand up and configure remote environments and be able to connect to those. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up that configuration that we had running in the sandbox to see what kind of progress we're making here. And I'll go ahead and go into questions and answers at this point. So I see Greg asked a question about if this is based on an early release of Winget. I do have the 1.7 preview installed on my device that I'm using, but the 1.6 that is GA release has all of the Winget configure as stable, and the PowerShell modules are published at the gallery. Right now, they should all be treated as pre-release, but that's really because we don't have full parity in the PowerShell modules. I want to be able to do things like the equivalent of Winget upgrade all, which will iterate over all the packages installed on my device and then run the upgrade command on all of them. So in PowerShell, I'd want to be able to do, something like, get Winget package where the updates are available and then pipe that to Winget upgrade or upgrade Winget package. No, the demo gods were not kind today. We need that the day before yesterday. Yeah. So when I joined the team to start working on Winget, I had just come from other companies that I'd worked for doing a lot of infrastructure as code or configuration as code. And those were, really painful experiences. But I knew before we tried to tackle something like that on Windows, we had to have a reliable package manager. One of the other things that we've heard a lot of feedback about has been, other organizations might have an investment in Chef or Puppet or Ansible. That was part of why we picked PowerShell DSC, because there's a lot of resources out there that already do that kind of integration. But, my vision, the roadmap that I'm looking at is really just making it as easy as possible to build these configuration files and to be able to share them and be able to reason about how you get an environment set up. A lot of the work has been around getting things configured for Git-based projects, but we also have a lot of other enterprise governance types of scenarios. Is the sample available? Currently use Chocolatey Box Starter. Okay. So a couple of great points there. I will publish these samples as soon as the modules get released for them, including all the scripts that I put together. I want to, share everything kind of in progress as we go. We are doing all of this open source, so you will be able to contribute as well. When it comes to Chocolatey, I did talk with the Chocolatey folks when I was in Prague a few months back, and I did talk about I would love to see the same sample configurations that we have available in DevHome available for Chocolatey as well. And I'll go ahead and pull that up again. So I would love to have a good PowerShell DSC resource for Chocolatey that the Chocolatey team is happy with. And then, for example, like this PowerShell configuration, instead of using the Winget DSC resource for installing the Winget package, I would love to have a configuration that does the same thing with Chocolatey. And Winget now has a Chocolatey MSI-based installer to get Chocolatey on the box. So you can pretty easily bootstrap Chocolatey with this. And then the idea would be you jump in and use the Chocolatey DSC resources for installing any software that you need with Chocolatey, and then the rest of the DSC with the configuration work that we're doing here. The last time I looked at Box Starter, it was really designed around a clean environment and going in and just getting the environment set up. I think one of the key differentiators that we have on the Wingate side of things is with DSC, if the resources are built correctly, they're idempotent. That means you can apply them over and over again, and they're not going to change the state of your device in a negative way. So Winget actually can do a configuration on a machine that already has things on it. Another challenge with that is you might be working on 2 or more projects that fundamentally have conflicting dependencies. So you do have to be careful with that. We are working on a compare type of a behavior where you can look at 2 configurations and compare them to be able to look for explicit conflicts. So one of them might say that it needs .NET 6. The other one says it needs .NET 6, but it needs an earlier version than the latest. So when you apply configuration, you could absolutely inadvertently break another project that you have. We are recording what we're configuring on the box so that we'll have the ability to kind of compare the configuration you're about to run to other things that have been applied on the device. And that's another area that we'd love to get some feedback to see what kinds of things you're interested in being able to compare and how we might be able to reason about it. Definitely, if you had a configuration that was using the Winget resource to install something, for example, and the other configuration you wanted to compare against was using Chocolatey to install something, we might not be able to detect those conflicts, but we'll at least be able to show you a side-by-side logical view of what these 2 configurations are doing, and you can actually compare and contrast them. Yeah, Manfred, I remember the demo of using Box Starter to bootstrap Chocolatey and Winget and use it to install stuff. It was pretty exciting stuff, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing a lot more feedback on what's going on with Winget and deeper partnership with the DSC community to make sure that we're embracing the open source nature of the community that's out there and building those resources. So it looks like we're still installing Visual Studio. Unfortunately, I don't think this one's going to finish in time for me to show you actually building the project using F5. Are there any other questions out there? Such a quiet audience. Is this overwhelmed, too much information coming at you too fast? Or is this, hey, everything makes perfect sense, I know what to do, and I know how to get started? I see a comment about Azure integration. Would you mind going a little bit deeper in what your question is around Azure integration? I'll jump ahead to the next question. Steve is asking about Windows Server. So Winget is not officially supported on Windows Server. Technically, it can work. If you bootstrap the app installer with Winget on Windows Server, you totally can use Winget there. You definitely need to be sure that it's something you want to install, because the app installer is considered a Windows system component. So if you install it on Windows Server, you're not going to be able to uninstall it. We've got a commandlet in the Microsoft.winget.client PowerShell module that is designed to essentially repair the Winget package manager. It's going to make sure you've got the right dependencies and pull the latest stable version down unless you specify the version you want. Currently, that doesn't work in Windows PowerShell, but we believe we've figured out which assembly we need to pull over to get that fixed. So that work is in progress. We're also working with the Windows Server team to bring in App Installer Inbox into the next version of Windows Server. I don't have any of the timelines on that, but we are doing some of the early testing and integration work. So I do fully expect Winget to be available on Windows Server in the future. All right. As an extension or guest configuration related to Azure integration. So there's a few things going on with the Azure side of things. We have been talking with the AVD, the Azure Virtual Desktop team, about doing some custom image templates so that you could go through the portal, select packages that you want installed, and get them installed on AVD images by default. But any of this should work on any of the different Windows desktop versions on Azure. You'll just need to make sure that you're upgrading to the latest version of Winget. You can either do that through the Microsoft Store, if that's available. If it's not, you can use aka.ms/getwinget just to pull down the latest version of App Installer and install it that way. And again, the Repair Winget Package Manager is the PowerShell commandlet that should be able to do that for you as well. Is Windows Server in the loop? Yep. So I answered that question. Have some bits about Azure guest config in DSC v3 talk today. Oh, awesome, Steve. I'll be watching that talk. When I say in the future for Windows Server support, my guess is it's probably going to be 12 months or more. I'm really not involved in the release cycle planning for Windows Server, but I know that that is a very long lead time. We have to do a lot of work to go through all of the testing and validation processes as we're building it, and we have to have all of those final bits completed well ahead of time before we start sharing those with hardware manufacturing partners to be able to have the next version of server land inbox. And I don't even actually know which calendar year that's scheduled to happen in. But definitely as we get more information, there's a discussion topic at GitHub for the Winget CLI where people are talking and sharing their use cases on Windows Server and sharing different scripts and different things that they have found that work to get things bootstrapped for them. I think another question I haven't seen, but I'll go ahead and answer. There's been a lot of discussion. This typically works in the user context. So app installer that delivers Winget is an MSIX application. And that particular package format, when you install it, it gets installed on the device and the bits get laid down. And when you have an interactive user login, that's what actually creates those virtual registry entries so that you can run Winget in the user context. And we've had a lot of asks around how Winget can be used in system context. And what we've done there is the client module for PowerShell actually can work in system context. One of the challenges that you'll run into is if an application is installed per user rather than for the entire machine, that doesn't work in the system context. So you'll need something to be able to do that for you when the user logs in. You can either do that with a logon script or another mechanism, and we're looking at ways to make that a little more graceful. But we certainly have challenges with all of the security constraints that we have to adhere to make sure that we're not allowing escalation of privilege, and some installers just don't support it. We've seen interesting things like Spotify will only allow you to install an admin, or sorry, only as a user, not an admin. So some people have complained they can't install Spotify in that context. Plenty of things around other permissions around installers, and that's usually where you're going to run into that friction. But what I found, honestly, is a lot of PowerShell users are, in some cases, more familiar with the installer constraints than not. What about redirecting HKCU when installing in system? So, I would say, broadly speaking, anything is technically possible with code, but that doesn't mean that it's something that we should do. We've also seen cases of some installers going in, even though they're claiming to be installed for the current user, so that HKCU reference, but they actually write registry entries into HKLM. And we've got some new guidance that we're working on around building installers or building packages, whether that's MSIX, MSI, or even one of the XE-based installers. We're going to add more guidance on how to build an installer and how to test it with Winget. And with a lot of this stuff that I've showed today with Sandbox, we want to make it easier so you can go into Sandbox and do some testing. With the Winget packages repository, when you're submitting a manifest, we do a lot of automated validations, and there's a Sandbox PowerShell script in the tools directory that will essentially allow you to pass in a pull request to deploy that package in the Sandbox. And we want to enrich that to go through some of the scenarios for upgrade and uninstall so that you can make sure that you've got a well-behaved installer. Next question I see here is Intune. So we have done some integration with Intune. Right now, the only source that they're supporting is the Microsoft Store. There's some work for them to stand up a private Winget package repository that's associated with Intune so that you can, as an enterprise, put your own set of packages in there rather than trying to fight AppLocker or creating allow or deny lists. And that also gives you a little more supply chain control. I've definitely seen a couple of commercial offerings. I think Nerd.io has a private source implementation that you can use. There's also Winget.pro. I've seen a couple of other open source projects that help with packaging. There's an Intune Win that will allow you to take things from the community repository and package them up and publish them into Intune. But definitely for any of those scenarios, reach out and let us know what you're interested in so that we can make sure to get the right kinds of contacts together. We've also been talking with the Intune team about leveraging Winget Configure so that you could actually push a configuration down to a device, not only apps or packages, but also these other things for configuration. And one of the really nice things about using PowerShell DSC is even for your private line of business apps that you don't want to put in public, you can build DSC resources for those and also configure your line of business apps. So the last question about the sandbox surviving reboots. So no, today the Windows Sandbox does not survive a reboot. We've been having some discussions with the Sandbox team to get them to take over the Sandbox DSC resource once we publish it. On the Winget team, part of supporting developers on Windows, we're really doing as much as we can in the open and pioneering building a lot of these resources as we see either lots of projects that depend on them or scenarios that we want to build. We're happy to jump out there and build these DSC resources, publish them, and then the goal would be to hand them back to the product teams that own them so that they can continue to ensure that they work with their product. That's one of the really big value propositions I see with what the DSC community has done. If you look at something like the SQL DSC resource or the Hyper-V DSC resource, those are pretty complex resources, and the Winget team just isn't staffed to, build and maintain all the DSC resources in the world. So that's really where the community comes in. Ideally, I think as this gets used more and more, we will see more customer demand going back to ISVs and software publishers, asking them for resources that will do this and making sure that they keep them functional. One of the big integrations that we see, especially with a lot of open source projects, is people are using Visual Studio as their IDE. And we've got DSC resources that will allow you to specify workloads and extensions and install them. But one of the current gaps with Visual Studio is there's not an API that allows me to actually retrieve any extensions that have been installed. So there's a lot of complexity around that and some product work that needs to happen. Ran out of storage on the Sandbox. I was hoping to be able to show you the full end-to-end on that one. Yeah, demos have been pretty tough today. One of the other examples of the community is the dev drive that I talked about for the REFS file system. We've also done some work to reduce some of the load on filter drivers and a new mode for Defender to be a little bit less intensive on that file system to give you some performance. And we've got pull requests open for the DSC resource for managing drives and volumes to include excuse me, to include support for dev drives. I'll stick around for some more Q&A, and I'll see if I can go ahead and get the demo kicked off. And if I can, and I get that end-to-end working, I'll pull a video together. But definitely let me know what other content you're interested in and what other things we can do to improve documentation. And I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from configurations that you've built that have been successful, as well as the ones that have given you trouble. And we're doing a lot of work right now around DSC v3 and the orchestration engine for that. We're going to add an experimental feature in Winget to start taking advantage of DSC v3 while it's still in early states, so that you can kind of switch back and forth between stable and what's new. And we'll be doing the same thing for the Winget export functionality. So that's another area to stay tuned and give us feedback. Yes, Winget Configure is a stable feature now. It's built on PowerShell DSC v2 that is stable, and the PowerShell team made invoke DSC resource a stable commandlet so that we could do that and take that dependency. We will continue in preview builds of Winget to do this work with experimental features and new things that are coming. And as sort of the technology stack underneath us becomes stable, that's when we go out with stable releases. So, we're going to do as much as we can to get you hands-on with the new stuff that's coming without risking those stable in-market things. Something else to be aware of, right now we don't have the ability to do things like pass credentials or secrets into configuration, and there's a newer version of the DSC v3 schema that's being iterated on at the PowerShell DSC GitHub repository. So we're going to look at pulling that in so that we can do things like pass in secrets or credentials, or take in variables or parameters into these configurations. We've also seen requests for things like, I would say, either chaining or logically gluing multiple configurations into one. And a lot of the challenges there are around how we can show a user what's in a configuration before they apply it. Yeah, I had fun with the respawn too. Oh, and I just realized that I had hit the wrong button and turned off my camera earlier. I apologize for that. All right, well, thanks everybody. Hope you enjoy the rest of the PowerShell MiniCon, and I'll be hanging out a little bit later today. But if you've got any questions, feel free to send me an email, reach out to me on X, or go to the GitHub repository and create issues or discussions. Thanks, everybody.